As Aidan told us, there are two very famous sections of the Torah reading this morning. One is the Shema and V'ahavta, and the second is the repetition of the Aseret HaDibrot, of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were given first in the book of Exodus when we stood at Sinai, and then 40 years later, Moses, in his benediction address that takes up the whole book of Deuteronomy, recaps the highlights and lowlights of the desert journey and retells the commandments to the people as best he remembers them. The two versions are basically identical. Don't murder, don't murder. Don't steal, don't steal. There are a few little word shifts here and there, but 9 out of 10 of the commandments are remembered the same way 40 years later. All except for one. The commandment to keep Shabbat is different in Deuteronomy than it is in the book of Exodus. In the book of Exodus, it begins, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'kodsho, remember Shabbat. In the book of Deuteronomy, it begins not with the word Zachor, remember, but with Shamor, guard. It includes a different rationale for Shabbat. In the book of Exodus, we're told to keep Shabbat in memory of the creation of the world. God worked 6 days and then rested. You get to do the same. And in the book of Deuteronomy, we're told that Shabbat is a reenactment of our exodus from Egypt. That Shabbat doesn't have anything to do with the creation of the world in general, but has to do with the creation of the Jewish people in particular, and the fundamental, foundational experience of going out of darkness and into light. There is one tiny change introduced in the Deuteronomy version that doesn't appear in the Exodus version, that my teacher, Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller, who directed UCLA Hillel for 40 years, told me when I was 19 years old was maybe the most important single word change in the Torah. Pointed to, and you have the text that came out to you, this word kamocha. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to your God. You shall do no work on it. You, your son or daughter, your slave, your animal, the strangers in your settlements, in order that your slave shall rest kamocha, as you do. That's not in the first version. It's only in the second version. First version tells us that everybody in our encampment is to rest. Free and in bondage alike, everyone is to rest, but the second version introduces this word kamocha. They're supposed to rest just the way you do. What happens when 1 day a week the distinction between slave and master ceases to be real? What happens when 1 day a week the person at this place in the hierarchy and the person at this place in the hierarchy rest exactly the same as one another? If for 1 day a week your slave, your person who has been debased, has removed their humanity in biblical slavery, it's more of an indentured servitude, but somebody who has lost their freedom, if for 1 day a week they are kamocha, they are the same as you, then how actually are they supposed to be understood as slaves the other 6 days of the week? Because if for 1 day you are equals, both children of God, made in the image, endowed with inalienable dignity, then how exactly can you ever set that aside? You know, there's a reason why in the American South during the period of slavery, it was a capital crime to teach a black person to read. It was a capital crime to teach a black person to read during the period of slavery Because the only way that you could maintain the illusion that some people were by right of birth master and some people were by right of birth slave was to imagine that there are two fundamentally different classes of humans. One more human and one less human. And the second, that those in that second class can do something like you can. In the moment that those people who've been relegated to the status of animals show their full humanity, the entire system falls apart. Because it's shown that that illusion, that separation, that idea that there are different classes of people that could exist, that God made us not equal sisters and brothers, but of different types, one to dominate the other. If that idea can be shown to be false one day of the week, then it is demonstrably false the other 6 too. The Torah, which allows for slavery, this book of an escaped slave people who in their laws allows for slavery, also contains within it the seed of that system's destruction. The seed that says that while we allow this ancient system, this system which was ubiquitous in the world to continue, while we allow it to continue, we assert the fundamental revolutionary equality of all human beings that ultimately will topple any system of slavery and oppression. Shabbat becomes the secret tool for overthrowing the old order, for asserting the equality of all human beings, for breaking down hierarchies which we as human beings may perpetuate, but from a God's eye view are all false. And it does something else. Not only does it lay bare this resting one day as you do, does it lay bare the falseness of this dichotomy between master and slave. It implants in the person who has been relegated to the status of slave a fuller awareness of their own humanity. Because if somebody comes to think of themselves as only ever a slave, my mother was a slave and her mother was a slave and her mother before that, they might believe that they deserve the status that they're in. They might not be able to imagine any other kind of a life. And so not only from the outside of the system does Shabbat challenge the system, but from inside of the human being kept in servitude, Shabbat plants the idea of the fullness of our humanity. It expands the boundaries of the imagination. Bell Hooks, the author and essayist and poet, wrote a line that I have long loved. What we cannot imagine cannot come into being. What we cannot imagine cannot come into being. Our world is constructed by the boundary of our imagination. And if we can't imagine that the world could be different than the world looks right now, different for us, different for our children, different for each other, if we can't imagine a more expansive and better future, we're for sure not going to get it. As we expand our capacity for imagination, we expand the boundary of the possible for ourselves and each other. Aidan, you quoted in your Devar Torah Theodor Herzl and the song Hatikva. For thousands of years, Jews said to ourselves, someday a Mashiach, a Messiah, will come and bring us back home. But unless God wills it, that's not possible for you and me. It's not possible for our children or for our grandchildren. Maybe someday, and we'll pray, but there's not a whole lot we can do beyond that. And then arose a generation of people, only a little more than a century ago, who said, maybe our imagination needs to be wider. The lens of our imagination needs to be expanded. Maybe it's possible that if we will it, it need not be a dream. And they resurrected a Jewish state after 2,000 years. Extraordinary. On a much, much, much different scale. Aaron Alexander took me to frozen yogurt 20 years ago at this little place in West Hollywood called Pinkberry that you had to be in the know to go to. There was a line for Pinkberry like it was a club on Sunset. You stood there for an hour to get unsweetened, and it turned out not real frozen yogurt. There was a lawsuit that clarified this. It wasn't even yogurt. And like celebrities were dropped off in cars. We were waiting in line, and Jane Lynch got out of a car and went in for her Pinkberry in front of us. And we talked about the possibility that I might go to rabbinical school. And that was something that, while I had flirted with vaguely, was really outside of the boundary of my imagination for what my life could be. And here was this mentor, still in your 5th year of school. This guy somewhere between a camp counselor and a big brother, who said, think bigger about your life. You could do this too. The last 20 years of my life have been shaped by the stretching of imagination that you gave me over some crappy yogurt in West Hollywood. When we can't imagine something gets better, it's not going to get better. When we can't imagine that something is possible, it's never going to happen. When we start to believe that the way things are is the way it will always be, we're right. And even if we don't know the way that we can make our imagined world come into being, if we're stuck and stymied and unsure about how it might come to be, we still have a responsibility to imagine. Can we imagine a world in which Americans of different ideologies and different ways of life come together and talk together about what is good for all of us and shape a future with every one of our neighbors in mind? Could we imagine that America? If we can imagine it, we can build it. If we've given up the imagining, it'll always be like this. Can we imagine an Israel in which the cycle of endless war and conflict, of insecurity and bloodshed, can we imagine a different kind of a future? Can we imagine what it would be like for the next generation to grow up in a peaceful land? I don't know how we get there, but I know if we don't allow ourselves to imagine it, we never will. And what would it take? What would it take for a child growing up in Gaza to be able to imagine? To imagine a different kind of future for themselves too. To imagine a different path forward, to imagine that it won't always be like this for them. And what's our responsibility to allow that imagining to happen as well? If for one day a week, the one who is different than you is like you, then it turns out they were like you all along. If for one day a week, the person who sees themselves by every social force as less than comes to know their full greatness, their full possibility, then that can never, ever be taken from them. If they can imagine it, they can build it. If we can imagine it, we can build it. And if we give up on our dreams of better, we consign ourselves and our future to the darkness. We're not allowed to do that. Jews are not people of despair. We are people of big dreams and big hopes since the very beginning. Shabbat Shalom.